So it's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Meredith Kirley. Dr. Kirley is a psychologist with over 30 years' experience in child and family welfare. She's worked in community service organisations in casework and program management and has specialised in out-of-home care. Meredith's PhD was titled Family Links, Kinship Care and Family Contact, and her numerous research projects have focused on a range of human service areas with a focus on vulnerable children and out-of-home care, especially the growing rate of kinship care. Meredith currently works at the University of Melbourne Department of Social Work, and today she will be speaking to us about contact between infants who have been taken from their birth parents and restoration outcomes. Welcome.
A little bit hard to follow the acts that have preceded me. They've been so stunning, haven't they? However, I'll do my best. So I want to talk to you today about two projects. Basically, I'm here to talk to you about the infants in care and family contact research that we did a few years ago and its implications for restoration practice. But I also want to introduce some material from a later project, the Family Links one that was referred to a moment ago, because in the baby project, as we call it, we were unable to include the views of parents for various reasons to do with that first year of life and endless court cases and litigation, horrible things. And I was very determined in this second project that we would have all the stakeholders involved. And so I've pulled out of that project the material around perspective from parents, just to complement the other material. So we'll start by having a look at the Baby on Board project. So just to set the scene is baby Lucy. Now, clearly we're talking about a very emotive issue, and we're talking about little babies of 12 months and under. And I've now got my first granddaughter in that age period, and yeah, it's a very emotive subject, isn't it? So when they're in care, we're aware of their extreme vulnerability and quite complex issues around attachment as to who is the primary carer of an individual infant. So little baby Lucy is an example of the sort of baby we came across in this project. Premature feeding difficulties in foster care. And a baby that was asked or required, she wasn't asked, to be in the car 5 days a week to come to the departmental offices for contact visits with the mother and father. So a very small baby who's still establishing routines. These visits could be any time of the day because the workers actually have a punishing schedule of contact arrangements and they can't necessarily fit them all in at the same time every day. And nor can they really prioritise continuity of workers with each case, even though they might try to. So a lot of different people involved in this little baby's life. So what do we know about this area? So we know that infants in care comprise the greatest percentage of deaths of children known to child protection. The rate of children entering care in Australia has been rising for many years, although, as Elizabeth pointed out, it's dropping in New South Wales, and that the rate of Indigenous children coming into care is many times that of the rest of the population. A number of assumptions underpinned this project that we engaged in. The obvious one about our obligation to protect the right of the child to contact with their parents unless there's overwhelming reasons not to. That we would like to see children restored to their families whenever possible. This is the one that isn't still widely accepted. It's hard to believe this, but there are still people and professional people, particularly certainly in the courts of Victoria, who believe that the primary attachment of a baby will always be to their biological mother, regardless of the experience of that child in terms of who's looked after them. We do, however, know that babies can make a small number of multiple attachments, and so it is possible for an infant who's having good contact with a mother or a father or indeed somebody else may be able to have multiple attachments. We know that the first years are critical, and we know so that the child's development does need to be carefully supported through that time if they're going to have a good life. So for the aims of this project, we wanted to explore best interests in relation to intensive family contact. This had become quite an issue in Victoria a few years ago, where the courts were ordering very high levels of contact between babies and their parents, in the belief that this would promote restoration to family. And we wanted to explore that belief and see what it was doing to babies, what it was doing to other people around the baby. We wanted to have a look then at what the directions would be for good practice. Now the third aim, which I've called a serendipitous aim, this was really probably the part of the project that's of most interest to this seminar today, that we looked at rates of reunification for children with very high levels of contact with family and those who had lower levels of contact. These are the components of the project. So we actually reviewed the electronic case file of every baby who was 12 months of age or under on a particular date, a snapshot date. We also did a lot of focus groups and interviewed a few people who were unable to get to those focus groups. Those focus groups covered a whole range of stakeholders that I will outline for you in a moment. People started telling us stories. They wanted to tell us lots of stories. So we thought, well, okay, let's collect these. And so we've called them brief case studies. And as I mentioned, because of the situation of that first year where the court process is very active, I was actually quite shocked to see how many times children were returning to court. Multiple court cases, changes of orders or renewal of temporary orders, that in that context it wasn't possible to ask for contact with parents. So we looked at the various aspects of the issue in our literature review, development, attachment, reunification. We looked at the literature that was in place at that time on family contact for children out of home care, and it was very interesting to hear Elizabeth Fernandez' update on that. And we also looked at what was written about infant transportation. Not very much, in fact. We did find that there was no evidence-based research about the impact of high-frequency contact on little babies, but there were some indications that other factors other than the frequency of contact were as important or possibly more important. There was some medical literature expressing concern about the safety of little babies in car travel, talking about breathing and blood oxygen depletion, which they call desaturation. So reviewing the child protection case files, as I say, it was a eye-watering detail. There were a number of screaming fits from us at times because I think the files have improved since then, but they were extremely slow back then, and we just had to spend hours and hours and hours on one case. Of our sample, one third had a condition specifying high-frequency contact, and we defined that as 4 or more visits a week to family, and we chose to include all family visits in that because we felt that the impact on the baby was similar in terms of the amount of travel and disruption. I hesitate about the figure of 1/3 because actually it was 1/3 of orders, but six babies had 2 orders, so it was actually more like 1/4 of the babies had these high-frequency orders. A lot of variations in terms of the conditions for those visits, location, length of visit time, duration of the order. So this is where the babies were at the time of the high frequency order. You can see that there was a small number still in hospital. The majority were in foster care. When you add the kin care and the kin care with a parent living in, that's second most likely. I would suspect if we were doing this study now, you'd find that kinship care group would be the biggest group. So the age at which the order was made, mostly when the baby was very little. So you can see that a lot of them were in that first couple of months of their entry to care, but they did continue on over the first year of life. And the duration of the orders, so a number of them, lasted for a couple of months. Others were a lot shorter, some were much longer. There were one or two that were still ongoing at the time that we finished the project. So we had a look at where the visits took place. The big column is at the departmental office. So most of these babies, and remember most of them were in foster care, and I think probably the culture is still the same, that in foster care there is a higher expectation that supervised contact will be external to the care home. So most of those were in the departmental offices. You've also got a range of other locations there. Very small number in the kin home in this case. I think now you'd find that would be a very large group. But hospital, parents' home, community organisation, or a combination. We also tried to look at, as far as was documented, why visits didn't take place in the way that they were ordered. Legal advocates for the parents in court quite often argued that the department didn't cooperate with those orders. We know that the burden on the department was huge, and I remember at the time hearing from one of the senior workers saying all the arguments you'll hear on the floor will be about contact visits and the stress it was placing on child protection. Not that this is a primary consideration, and the courts rightly said so, but nevertheless, I think the biggest problem was that time was being sucked out of the time available for good casework, child protection workers getting in the car and driving. However, we did find that despite that, it wasn't actually the departmental resourcing that was the problem in terms of compliance with the order, that the department was very compliant with their orders. We couldn't always tell what the reasons were, but it was clear that given that most of these families had substance abuse issues, that sometimes these very high-frequency contact orders were just too difficult for a family, for a parent or parents who are struggling to overcome a substance dependency. And when you think that sometimes the requirement was that you get up, you get on a bus and you get on a train, and you might have one or two other kids still at home with you, you've got to organise them and get them going. And the visit will be at a time that fits in with these punishing routines in the departmental office, not a time that suits your family. So if it's 9 o'clock in the morning and you've got to do all of that and get there by 9, not to mention find the bus and the train fare, well, that's the way it is. And if that's too hard for you, well, then you didn't comply. So that was certainly an issue at times. There were, sometimes there was parent or parents who were missing, sometimes they were sick, sometimes the baby might have been sick, so the baby in fact was unable to come. Sometimes a parent was in jail, sometimes it was a behavioural issue. And the other thing that we noticed was that we think that the environment was a factor in terms of motivating people to come or not to come for their visits. I think we've heard already pretty poor environments for contact, pretty unfriendly, pretty threatening, despite the best efforts of staff. And I mean, any of us who've got children or have had children can easily imagine, even if you leave out the grief and distress and multiple issues that a family is grappling with. What's it like to go and see your little kid sitting on a chair with their feet not touching the ground, a couple of desultory toys in the corner, and you're trying to make conversation with that kid? How was school? And, you know, and somebody watching you all the time. It's just the most miserable experience. Weekend contact was a particular problem because our departmental offices were closed, and we have a lack of suitable weekend venues. So we heard of situations where people were meeting in shopping centres. We even had one in the bathrooms at a shopping centre, because then there's a baby change table and all the rest. So that was deemed to be the place for contact. But sometimes it was McDonald's, or sometimes that works, well, sometimes it doesn't. And of course, supervision, we've heard this, the tension between assessment, looking at physical safety, and supporting and mentoring parents. Pretty impossible dual role for a child protection worker. It would appear from what we saw that when the visits moved from the home setting to departmental offices, non-attendance increased, conflict increased, although we can't again say really what's cause and what's consequence there. But if we look at the location versus the proportion of visits that occurred, you can see that in the departmental offices. We also had a look at the quality of contact, and we saw a lot of variation there. We saw parents who were in a position to be tuned into their infants, but many parents who weren't in that position. And when we remember that a lot of these families are affected by substance dependencies, that's why children have been removed, or that's been a major reason. So this was where we got to when we had a year's data, and we were able to look at, well, who got reunified and who didn't. And what we found was that one group had a 23% reunification rate, and one group had a 22% reunification rate. Now, given the sort of woolly data we were pulling out of files, we can readily say that that 1% is within the margin of error, that there was no difference that we could determine between the reunification rate with those who had high frequency orders and those who didn't. These were the participants in the focus groups and interviews. So we talked to case support and child protection workers, both in the country and in the metro region. At the time, we had high-risk infant team, so we particularly wanted to talk to them. I was being assisted by a young man who had a social work degree, but he also had a law degree, and he was able to say, well, I've worked in the Children's Court Advisory Unit, and I think you ought to talk to some of the lawyers about the issue. So we did talk to that group, the Children's Court Advisory Unit of the department, but we also had a focus group with lawyers who worked for Victoria Legal Aid. We also, of course, talked to foster carers and to their managers. In terms of the impact on babies, we were asking, in all of these groups, we asked for examples of good experiences with high-frequency family contact, and they were rare. So the sorts of things that really came up more frequently were reports of multiple people handling infants, transporting babies, supervising visits, so that it was not uncommon for 3 people to be involved in one visit. So it might be one driver to go and pick up the baby, bring them to the department, someone else to supervise the contact in that little room, and then someone else to drive the child back. So you were getting a lot of people involved in these small babies' lives. To the extent that one mother said to us, "Does my baby know that I'm the mother?" And it was very difficult to say yes, because so many people were marching through that little baby's life that she didn't have a lot more airtime than all those other people. There were lots of reports of behavioural signs of distress around visits. Now, of course, these babies are pre-verbal, so we have to read the signs, but there were plenty of signs of distress. And the carers were seeing this more than anybody, and of course, carers of babies have big hearts. That's why they do that work. That's why they're good at it. And they were becoming really reluctant to care for babies in this situation. It was too distressing. These were the sorts of things they were reporting, babies that would be very wakeful the night after visits, or indeed all the time if there was high-frequency contact, sobbing themselves to sleep, being tired, being grisly, clingy. That awful situation of the carer having to hand over a screaming baby because that baby knows that he or she doesn't want to go again. And then the situation of an unsettled baby with visits during the week settles down over the weekend and it all starts again on Monday. So with an older baby you get a little bit of a clearer signal, and this was one quote from a carer. He doesn't like his dad. Sometimes he turns his head from me on return because he's now 11 months. And this awful one, a friend came to visit, crawled up to me in fear and hung on to me and looked at me anxiously, followed me in fear. Is this someone who's going to come and take me away? There was one group who had a whole different story to tell us, and these were the lawyers who were frequently acting for parents. These were lawyers, mature people, couple of blokes, one woman, who'd been doing this sort of work for a long time and had developed some fairly fixed ideas about, the department doesn't know what it's doing. There are all these young workers who can't argue their case in court, and they're not interested in parents. Well, of course, there's truth in everything, unfortunately. But they really had developed a fixed idea about this, and they'd also developed a fixed idea that high-frequency contact was critical to the success of getting an infant home to their parents, which kind of superficially makes sense, and we've seen that there is a correlation. But they were so sort of fixed in this view that in fact we heard stories of where a departmental worker had made an agreement with a parent, had worked cooperatively and worked out something that was going to work for the parent, and then gone into court, and the lawyer had said to the parent, well, I'm not going to argue that case for you. I'm happy to see my infant twice a week because you'll never get your baby back that way, so I'm going to go in and argue for 5 times a week or 7 times a week. And so it was actually not necessarily an empowering thing for the parent. We actually had at the time, and I've no reason to believe it's changed since then, a highly adversarial children's court that was really militating against the protection of infants' best interests. These lawyers really had difficulty accepting that an infant's primary attachment is not always to the biological mother. We tried to say, well, it may be, depending on the history, it may be there's multiple attachments, or it may be that in fact this child has been in care from early days and has not had a lot of contact with their mother, and the primary attachment is elsewhere. High frequency contact was rarely working to really build the bonds between infants and their parents. It seemed to be hard on everybody. And it was fairly clear that parents were not getting the support, mentoring that they needed during those visits. So we really could, it was clear to us that the quality of the contact was the thing that needed to be improved rather than the quantity, that the locations were certainly a problem and that we need to relook at locations. It was interesting what Reese said about children and the comments they made about locations that were good for them, which certainly wasn't just sitting in an office. That we had a lot of work to do in Victoria in terms of getting all the parties to work together. We could see that sometimes daily contact could be a very good thing, but it's context specific, and that there are improvements that don't necessarily cost heaps.